Hey YouTube, what's up? This is Reviewer97, and today we're going to start off my channel with an old horror movie from the 1950s. And this film is a film that pretty much revitalized a whole generation and pretty much rebooted the whole series of horror for the years to come. This film is 1957, The Curse of Frankenstein, made by Hammer Studios. Hammer was a company out of England that pretty much were responsible for rebooting the whole series of classic horror like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, you name it. They remade a good amount of them. But what I'm going to say is that The Curse of Frankenstein was a film that was very much different than the original 1931 James Whale version of Frankenstein starring Boris Karloff and Colin Clive. This film was actually shot in color, meaning that it was much more disturbing and much more violent than any of the other horror movies that came out beforehand. Back then you'd see like a thing of Hershey's chocolate going down a drain like in Psycho. Oh no, this was actual red blood. Not real blood, but it was paint or whatever they used, you know, it was red. It wasn't, you know, the chocolate syrup effect. So anyhow, The Curse of Frankenstein is probably, again, like I said, named one of the most famous horror movies ever made, and is probably famous for revitalizing the generation and changing Hammer Studios forever. Let's get into the review. The Curse of Frankenstein starts off in 1868 as Dr. Baron Frankenstein, played by Peter Cushing, is awaiting execution by the guillotine. He then calls upon the village priest to hear upon his story. He then decides that he will tell a story, and when he tells it, you start to hear about Frankenstein's past. Frankenstein was a young person, and his family died, and then his family left pretty much everything for Frankenstein. And at this moment, we are introduced to Paul. And Paul is a character that becomes his mentor and also becomes his sidekick later on in life. Frankenstein and him try to find certain ways to bring certain people and things back to life. They start out by bringing a little dog back to life, only to decide later to bring life to a human creature. Frankenstein's methods are much brutaler and much more violent than in the previous films and in other adaptations of this film. He actually kills people for his creation, and he will actually do whatever he needs to do to get his creation made. One night he has a guest over who was one of his old professors, and he has him over because he wants to use his brain for the monster. So he pretty much kills him, and then on the eve of his funeral, he goes back and steals his brain. When Paul finds this out, he decides he does not like Frankenstein's methods, and he decides to not want to be a part of it anymore and tries to keep Frankenstein away from it. He then tries to snatch the brain away from him, which is only crashed into a wall and destroyed. Not too long after this, Frankenstein finally brings life to his monster, which he realizes does not behave like he would like it to behave. It doesn't follow command, it doesn't do anything, it's psychotic, and its only motive is really to kill. It's not really obedient like some of the other ones where he just wants love and compassion and starts going crazy because nobody will give it to him. The monster is played by Christopher Lee, who is also referred to as the Creature, and from here on out it is just pretty much a huge battle between Frankenstein trying to get his creation to be obedient, and also Paul trying to keep Frankenstein away from it and trying to help him until he realizes there's nothing else to do but to go tell the authorities about it. My thoughts on The Curse of Frankenstein are that it's a classic film from the old classic genre of horror, and this is the beginning of Gothic films, which is amazing, and it was amazing to see the fact that they were able to adapt this version of Frankenstein. It was very hard to adapt a version of Frankenstein after the classic 1931 version with Boris Karloff, and the image was very hard to redo. But it was done, and it was remade, and it still is a classic to this day among many horror movie fans. Now to share some fun trivia with you. In The Curse of Frankenstein, this was probably one of the first movies to be actually shot in color, and actually was, you know, at the time was very controversial for the movie industry to show actual color blood, as at the time that was not a normal thing to do. The film actually did do this, and there were also many scenes that also had to be cut from the film due to some of the violence and the gore, such as a scene where Frankenstein is holding an eyeball from a man he bought. He's holding it in a little tweezer thing, and he's looking through it with a magnifying glass, which the shot had to be cut and just cuts away to Frankenstein looking through the magnifying glass with the eyeball in vague view, which you really can't see. But again, it is the film is, you know, just amazing, and I love it. And then also the original look of the monster could not be used. Universal actually threatened lawsuits if they tried to copy the Boris Karloff image. So a new art designer was hired to remake a new monster for Hammer and to make him look much different than the Boris Karloff version, which would become the classic, iconic look of Christopher Lee. The Curse of Frankenstein is a much older film, and for children to watch, I would say this is a film that would be okay for anyone maybe around 11 years old and up. If you're under that age, you might want to sit and watch it with a parent. The reason being is that this film did have violence in it, and the film is actually in color, so there are scenes of blood and there are scenes of minor gore due to the fact that this film takes place a lot in a laboratory. But again, it is an older film, and the effects are much cheesier than what they are now. And this film is not as violent as a modern slasher film such as Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream. It's not as violent as any of those movies, and it comes nowhere close even to a modern Frankenstein film. But I would recommend, again, like I said, if you're under 11, you might want to reconsider thinking about watching The Curse of Frankenstein for the first time, and you might want to watch it with your folks. But again, the choice is yours. It depends on how much you can take in a movie and how much violence and disturbing images you can take. There are not many in The Curse of Frankenstein, but when they happen, they're very brief and they're very cheesy, I would say. There are scenes that are somewhat disturbing, like one I will give you an example of right now. If you take a look up on my TV screen, you will see a scene from The Curse of Frankenstein where the creature is shot by Paul, which was very disturbing and gruesome to show in 1957. The creature has been shot in his head and is bleeding profusely from his head, which was very gory and very disturbing for 1957. Thoughts on The Curse of Frankenstein is that it's a classic film, and it is a film that is probably going to be remembered for many generations to come. Although the film has been very outdated since it was made back in the 1950s, it is still a masterpiece of horror by Hammer Studios. Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing would go on to play many more characters in the Hammer Studios roles, such as Dracula, which Christopher Lee played, and Dr. Van Helsing, which Peter Cushing played in the next film, Dracula. But Frankenstein was not gone forever. No siree. He returns in a new film called The Revenge of Frankenstein. That is it for The Curse of Frankenstein. If I had to give this film a rating, I had to give it a sharp 4 out of 5 for mostly rebooting a whole universe of horror movies, and for bringing to the screen something no one has dared to bring to the screen, and just for priceless acting and for priceless things that you just cannot get nowadays. Thank you for tuning into Reviewer 97, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at another monster who only comes out at night.